Pokemon which give up multiple prize cards when knocked out have existed in the TCG for over 2 decades. Back when the mechanic was new, the power level gap between EX and non-EX Pokemon was much smaller, and it seemed like the designers of the game weren't sure how powerful these new multi-prize Pokemon should be. As a result, the power level Pokemon EX in the Ruby and Sapphire block varied greatly, with both incredible and absolutely awful cards seen print. And starting off at number 10, we have Claydol EX, a card with a very interesting story around it. Once per turn, the Type Shift Pokepower lets you change this Pokemon's type to Fighting. For 2 colorless energy, Psychic Boom deals 20 damage, plus 10 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. Lastly, for 2 Psychic and 1 colorless energy, Shadow Crash dealt 60 damage and give you a choice to discard 1 energy attached to Claydol EX. If you did, you could discard 1 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. As both a Psychic and Fighting type Pokemon, Claydol EX could deal double damage by hitting for weakness against a variety of popular Pokemon. Popular cards like Absol EX, Dark Tyranitar, Gardevoir EX, and Manectric EX were all hit super effectively by the dual typing of Psychic and Fighting. Pair this with 2 decent attacks in Psychic Boom and Shadow Crush, and many people saw Claydol EX as having competitive potential. When this card first released in the final set of Ruby and Sapphire block, allegedly, some high-level players saw these positive attributes and hyped up the card on an old forum board as a joke. Despite all Claydol EX's positive aspects, the card was not good. Psychic Boom and Shadow Crush could be good attacks, but most of the time it would be below rate. The format at the time this card's release revolved around either Stage 1 decks filled with utility and efficient attackers, or Stage 2 evolution decks with high damage output, like both versions of Flygon EX or Empoleon. Compared to other Stage 1 decks, Claydol was too slow and inefficient. 3 energy for Shadow Crush's 60 damage and an energy discard wasn't viable into fast attackers like Rayquaza EX and Banette EX, and Psychic Crush's damage was often outpaced by these same cards. Into slower decks, the damage output fell behind attacks like Flygon EX's Psychic Pulse, and energy discard didn't matter in the face of supportive Flygon, which quickly reattached any missing energy. In spite of these problems though, people did actually experiment with Claydol EX at competitive events because of the high-level players' joking commentary about the card's strength. But this usage faded away the moment players ended events with it and realized its shortcomings. With slightly better attacks to take better advantage of the phenomenal dual type provided by Type Shift, Claydol EX might have been a decent anti-meta deck. Unfortunately though, its attacks just weren't better than the competition, and now the card's only notable points are how it was used by 2007's best players as a joke. And at number 9, we have Tyranitar EX, one of the few cards in the Pokemon TCG's history to put special counters on cards. This card's unique gimmick revolves around the Electromark attack. For 1 electric and 1 colorless energy, Electromark puts a Shockwave marker on one of your opponent's Pokemon. Then for 2 electric and 1 colorless energy, the Shockwave attack lets you knock out any Pokemon with a Shockwave counter on it. This card also had a more normal attack. For 1 electric and 2 colorless energy, Hyper Claws dealt 70 damage plus 20 more if the defending Pokemon was a Stage 2. The number 1 glaring issue with this card is how gimmicky the Shockwave counters are. On paper, the attack functions as a high damaging snipe attack similar to the previously meta-defining Blaziken EX, but with 2 turns as setup instead of energy discard. When put in those terms, Shockwave's fun counter gimmick just feels like any other attack that 2-hit KOs Pokemon. In fact, the gimmick of placing counters and then knocking out a Pokemon is actually worse than many other bench sniping attacks because it matched up so poorly into single prize or a low HP Pokemon. Compared, once again, to Blaziken EX, over 2 turns, repeated Volcanic Ash attacks could take out 2 widely played utility Pokemon, like Pidgeot or Magcargo, whereas it would take 4 turns for Shockwave to do the same. Shockwave does have advantages over Volcanic Ash, in that the attack doesn't require a consistent supply of energy acceleration. But its inability to KO single prize bench utility Pokemon really harmed Tyranitar EX's viability as a bench attacking Pokemon. If you want to use Shockwave to knock out your opponent's active Pokemon, the attack looks even worse. Why set up a functional 2-hit KO with gimmicky counters when you can do so using damage counters? Hyper Claws is a decent attack capable of knocking out most Pokemon in the game, excluding any electric type resistances. Dealing 90 damage to a Stage 2 Pokemon for 3 energy was an efficient rate at the time, and when given the choice between setting up Shockwave counters or damage counters, you'd almost always prefer the damage. When a card's most interesting aspect is outright worse than its generic attack, what else can you call it but a failed design? Luckily for Tyranitar, its generic attack does save it from being further down the list. And at number 8, we have Altaria EX. This Stage 1 Pokemon has a combination of decent ability and attacks. While in the active spot, the Mist Pokebody lowered all damage dealt to this Pokemon from your opponent's Stage 2 Pokemon by 30. For 1 Colorless Energy, Dive dealt 20 damage. Lastly, for 1 Water, 1 Electric, and 1 Colorless Energy, Dragon Mist dealt 70 damage and ignored all effects of your opponent's active Pokemon. By modern standards, Mist's 30 damage reduction may not seem like much, but when this card was released, attacks were far weaker. As an example, a lower damage output Stage 2 Pokemon like Politoed EX or Metagross would have some issues dealing meaningful damage to it. Sadly, for Altaria EX, that's where the positives of this card end. The most glaring issue with this card is actually its ability to survive powerful attacks, despite its Pokebody. 100 HP was the lowest amount any Stage 1 Pokemon EX had during this time in the TCG, often given to cards with powerful utility or attacks, like Manectric EX or Jolteon EX. These more damage-centric cards don't mind having lower HP, since the decks built around them focus on being more aggressive and taking KOs. For a more defensive card like Altaria EX, however, the low HP means it can't actually fulfill its role of matching it well into Stage 2 Pokemon. Some decks like Delta Metagross could just deal over 130 damage with a single attack, while other Stage 2 strategies such as Dark Dragonite had to access non-Stage 2 attackers. Mist also got disabled by the widely played Battle Frontier. Granted, it wasn't commonly played in Stage 2 decks. Not to mention, all of these decks didn't have to urgently one-hit KO Altaria EX because its damage output was so low. Dive dealing 20 damage for 1 energy was fine. At the very least, it gave you something to do while building up to Dragon Mist. The problem is Dragon Mist isn't anything special. Dealing 70 damage for 3 energy was just okay, and there weren't many effects around for the attack's upside to ignore. When all of the not so great abilities come together on a single card, you get a Pokemon EX that's not worth playing over any other. And at number 7, we have Flygon EX, the third EX card printed for Flygon. This card's Pokebody gives it a more defensive playstyle than the other two. This Psychic Protector Pokebody allows you to discard up to 4 cards from your hand whenever this Pokemon is attacked, and then reduce the damage of that attack by 10 for each card discarded. Also, for 3 colorless energy, Slashing Strike deals 70 damage and flips a coin. If tails, you can't use Slashing Strike during your next turn. The weakness of this Flygon EX are extremely apparent when you compare the card to its 2 predecessors. Slashing Strike is laughably bad for a Stage 2 Pokemon EX and comes nowhere close to the power of Psychic Pulse's 80 base damage plus damage counter spread, or Reactive Blast and Dragon Claw's damage. Despite its weak damage, Slashing Strike also has the potential downside of being unusable during your next turn, making this Flygon EX one of the worst EX Pokemon for actually dealing damage. Psychic Protector is what's meant to make this card stand out from the rest of the EX Flygons. When combined with its massive 150 HP and 2 resistances, some decks may struggle to knock out its setup Flygon EX, as long as the player can maintain a large hand size. Keeping enough cards to discard long term was a serious problem though. Unlike the modern TCG where card draw is abundant and players can easily refill an empty hand, the best option for generic card advantage were TV Reporter and Hold-On Adventurer, 2 cards that couldn't offset the maximum discard of 4 cards to Psychic Protector, and more conditional cards like Steven's Advice and Hold-On Scientist. There were also few ways to reuse any card you discarded for Psychic Protector in the format, so you'd have to be careful not to discard any card which may be important later. Even if you want to build a deck around constantly refilling your hand to enable the 40 damage reduction every turn, it would often be overkill. The other 2 Flygon were both extremely difficult to KO, because they also had 150 HP, on top of being a far more threatening card due to their higher damage output. Psychic Barrier Flygon EX, by virtue of having such a terrible attack, gave opponents much more time to break through the high HP. Flygon EX is a card with a very interesting design, but ultimately falls short of actually being good. And at number 6, we have Gyarados EX, a high HP Stage 1 Pokemon with expensively high damage output. For 1 water and 1 colorless energy, Twister deals 40 damage and flips 2 coins. For each heads, you discard 1 energy attached to defending Pokemon, but the attack fails if you flip 2 tails. Second, for 2 water and 3 colorless energy, Dragon Rage deals 100 damage. This card released alongside the meta-defining Blastoise EX and was clearly intended to partner alongside it. Blastoise's energy range set up Dragon Rage's 5 energy cost easily, while Gyarados' high HP helped offset the damage counters from the Pokepower. While you were setting up Blastoise EX, you could even use Twister to deny energy from your opponent and slow down aggression. The biggest issue with this intended role is that Gyarados EX was frequently a redundant Pokemon. The role of high damaging water type was something Blastoise itself could fulfill with its Hyper Whirlpool attack, being only 20 damage less, and also having an energy discard effect. The format was a slow enough pace that you didn't need a card like Gyarados to deny energy in the early game, and were better off taking time to set up draw engines in Delcatty or Pidgeot. Even if you wanted access to a higher damage attack than Hyper Whirlpool, Gyarados EX was never the best option. Once Holon's Cast Form and Magneton were released, Blastoise Dex could enable almost any attacker in the game. These Pokemon could be attached to a Pokemon by returning 1 energy from said Pokemon back to your hand, and while attached, provided 2 energy of any type. With flexible energy types at its disposal, Lugia and Steelix EX became its best partners for both one-shot potential and bench damage respectively. With such great competition, Gyarados EX had no way to stand out. There was no room for Gyarados EX to be its own standalone deck either. Twister's reliance on coin tosses kept it from being a consistent option. If you wanted to play an energy denial based control deck, Stantler and Minun, backed up by POW Hand Extension, Energy Removal 2, and Cetacean Crystal, were far better. For being outclassed in both roles the card tries to fill, Gyarados EX earns this spot on the list. And at number 5, we have Kabutops EX, a card that references 2 older Kabutops cards. For 1 colorless energy, Hydro Cutter lets you flip a coin for each energy attached to this Pokemon, up to a maximum of 3 times. For each heads, the attack deals 40 damage. Also, for 2 fighting and 2 colorless energy, Spiral Drain deals 70 damage and removes 2 damage counters from Kabutops EX. While being a fossil Pokemon would usually be a death sentence for a card's viability on its own, due to how you can't search the trainer card fossils with usual setup options, that wasn't a problem during this specific era. The Ruby Sapphire sets had some of the best options for fossil Pokemon in the game's history, with Strange Cave, Alolan Fossil, and the Team Assembly Pokemon all helped cheat out multiple fossil Pokemon. That didn't save Kabutops EX though, with the card having multiple fundamental issues. This card released in the Sandstorm expansion, the second ever set to have Pokemon EX, so it's understandable Kabutops' power level missed the mark. Before going into depth on this card, it's worth noting that both the cards this Pokemon borrowed attacks from were completely unplayable, arguably being some of the worst Stage 2 Pokemon in the game. Hydro Cutter has the same pitfalls most bad Pokemon EX do, requiring a coin flip to deal a maximum of 120 damage with 3 energy. Spiral Drain makes Kabutops EX fairly tough to knock out by healing damage dealt to its huge 150 HP. But with such a high energy cost, you get outpaced and take too much damage before being able to retaliate, even when using double rainbow energy for acceleration. Another wrench gets thrown into the plan of being difficult to KO when you notice Kabutops EX actually has 2 different weaknesses, widening the amount of Pokemon that can comfortably deal with it. Kabutops EX doesn't have any attribute that makes you want to play it. Its attacks are too weak and don't point you in any direction when deck building. As a result, Kabutops EX is left as a bad attacker with nothing interesting going on about it. And speaking of bad and uninteresting Pokemon EX, at number 4 we have Tyranitar EX. This card was released through promotional packs given to game stores for hosting Pokemon events, and so it was made intentionally bad. For 1 colorless energy, Bite does 20 damage. Also for 2 fighting and 2 colorless energy, Critical Crunch dealt 80 damage if you discarded 2 basic energy from this Pokemon. Otherwise, the attack did nothing. Now, both of these attacks are outright terrible. 1 energy for 20 damage is pretty meaningless, as seen with Altaria EX. But that attack on a Stage 2 Pokemon is laughable. The only upside here is that Tyranitar EX's damage output can be increased with Special Darkness Energy to deal a whopping 30 damage for 1 energy. That's equal damage to Dark Tyranitar's Grind attack without any of the upside of an unlimited damage cap. It's also equivalent in damage to the real Tyranitar EX's Shatter attack. Putting these 2 EX Pokemon side by side paints a very sad picture for promo Tyranitar. For 4 energy, albeit with a more daunting cost requirement, The real Tyranitar EX's losing control attack deals an extra 40 damage and has a far more manageable downside. Discarding 2 basic energies for only 80 damage is extremely harsh, heavily preventing access to cards like Double Rainbow Energy, which may otherwise help alleviate high attack costs. Promo Tyranitar EX doesn't even have higher HP than its counterpart to make up for much worse attacks. There is genuinely no reason to use this card. Funnily enough, this card isn't even the only bad Pokemon EX to release as a promo for organized play. And at number 3, we have Armaldo EX, a card released in the same promo pack as Tyranitar EX, being equally bad. For 1 fighting and 1 colorless energy, Twin Blade deals 30 damage to each defending Pokemon. Also, for 2 fighting and 3 colorless energy, Supersonic Claws deals 80 damage and ignores the defending Pokemon's resistance. The most interesting part of this card is the wording on Twin Claws, specifically the fact that it damages each defending Pokemon. Under the normal rule set, both players can only have 1 active Pokemon. With the release of Ruby and Sapphire sets, there was also an alternate format that allowed for 2 active Pokemon to coincide with the release of the double battles in the video games. The rules were mostly identical, except each player played with 2 active Pokemon. Twin Claws seems to be designed with this double battle format in mind. In the regular rule set, 30 damage for 2 energy is terrible. In a hypothetical double battle format though, the attack gets a bit more value. Unfortunately, the doubles format is now defunct, and as far as I'm aware, wasn't really played, and so it doesn't matter for determining how good this card actually was. This card is not good whatsoever. In fact, the similarities to Tyranitar EX don't end at being in the same set. There's also a real Armaldo EX, perhaps released as an apology for the awfulness of the promos. With 2 superior attacks and a Pokebody that granted a dual typing, Armaldo EX shows how bad this original promo card was. Somehow though, this isn't the worst promo EX to ever be released. And at number 2, we have Groudon and Kyogre EX. These 2 cards are so similar, it makes sense to talk about both at the same time. For 4 fighting energy, Groudon EX's Major Earthquake deals 80 damage. Then you discard 1 fighting energy and deal 10 damage to each of your bench Pokemon. For 4 water energy, Kyogre EX's Major Flood deals 60 damage. Then you discard 1 water energy attached to itself to deal 10 damage to each bench Pokemon. Kyogre EX is marginally better due to its synergy with Blastoise EX, but the card saw 0 competitive success. And both promos are equal levels of bad in a vacuum, so putting them together is reasonable. Both of these attacks have the same major flaw, that giant energy cost plus the downside of discarding energy to attack and damaging your own bench Pokemon. Outside of very niche cases, spreading damage across your whole board is never worthwhile, and is in effect usually reserved for high damage, low energy cost attacks. These attacks keep the theme of high damage, either doing 80 to the active or 60 to the active plus spread damage on your opponent's bench. But spending upwards of 4 turns attaching energy to do so is just too slow. The only upside to these cards over any other Pokemon EX was their HP of 120, which was actually the highest HP for any basic Pokemon at the time. Unfortunately, just having high HP on a basic isn't enough to secure any kind of competitive niche. If you ever played this card in a game, it would likely be a 100 HP wall that sits in your active spot and does nothing but take damage before getting knocked out. And lastly, at number 1, we have Chansey EX alongside all the other Haymaker Pokemon EX from the very first Ruby and Sapphire set. For those unaware, these cards are all based around iconic basic Pokemon from earlier in the game's history. Chansey EX is the most unique and outright bad out of these Pokemon EX, whereas the others follow the same general framework. For 2 colorless energy, Healing Egg removes 2 damage counters from all of your Pokemon except itself. Also, for 3 colorless energy, Double Edge deals 80 damage and 60 damage to Chansey itself. The other 4 cards all follow the same general framework of having a 1 energy cost attack, which deals a little damage, plus a second attack for a higher cost for more damage and a second effect, with both attacks being based on their original counterparts. With the exception to Mewtwo EX, none of these cards saw any kind of competitive usage or experimentation, and were a poor introduction to the Pokemon EX mechanic. Pokemon EX are supposed to be more powerful than a regular single prize Pokemon, except each of these callbacks to powerful basic Pokemon were worse than the originals in almost every way but HP. Many of their first attacks were either the same as the original cards, or nerfed compared to the original. None of these cards were good as Pokemon EX, with the changes to being two-prize Pokemon having affected Chansey EX the most negatively. Originally, base set Chansey was extremely difficult to knock out. The lower damage output of the game's earliest format, facing up against Energy Denial, Scrunch's damage prevention, and Chansey's massive 120 HP made the card almost unkillable as a stall option. In the Ruby and Sapphire format, those same Energy Denial options no longer existed. Pokemon dealt more damage, and Chansey EX had no way to prevent damage to itself. The one way this card got buffed with its retrain is a reduction to the cost of Double Edge. Dealing 80 damage for 3 colorless energy with a basic Pokemon was a very good rate at the time. But the recoil damage was a significant issue. If you ever use Double Edge to KO a Pokemon like Gorbis, your two-prize Pokemon's HP would get immediately reduced to KO range by most attacking Pokemon, giving your Pokemon an easy 2-for-1 prize trade. Even if your opponent didn't immediately take a KO, you would still have to heal your own Chansey EX somehow before it knocked itself out. It is extremely difficult to attack with this card and end up taking more prize cards than you give away by presenting an EX that often plays like it only has 60 HP, making it easily the worst Pokemon EX.